Okay, guys, so this week we are focusing in on Expressionism for week 5. The combination of sort of Expressionism in a lot of sort of different forms and groups, as well as Fauvism, which is very much a part of Expressionism as well. So, what is happening historically during this time period? We definitely have this ambivalence toward industrial commercial expansion gave way to renewed optimism. So some of the fear that the arts and crafts movement had is starting to sort of float away. We're moving through the 20th century avant-garde movements at a rapid pace, which you'll see. We're going to move from movement to movement to movement really fast, and sort of be kind of hard to keep up. Just sort of keep your mind wrapped around how they sort of each flow into one another in some capacity. Again, as I talked about like 2 weeks ago or so, there's still this focus on African and oceanic art and sort of within colonization of these continents as well. So Sahara African sculpture in particular came to symbolize the primitive pre-industrial other in the imagination of many Europeans and North Americans. And so potent was this link between African art and originality that several artists and critics claim to have been the discoverer of this art, right? Which is semi-ridiculous because, as we well know, African art is occurring before this, but people are just not aware of it because they're not colonizing these countries. So again, we're talking about primitivism. Remember this idea that these artists are influenced by this sort of African art and oceanic art, but and influenced by it, but in a lot of ways they're using it in this sort of very negative tone. So again, belief that non-Western or pre-industrial societies are more pure authentic than those of the West, resistance to progress, justifying aesthetic and economic exploitation through colonization. So remember, again, this is where Fauvism and Expressionism is as well. So when I use the term primitivism, remember what I'm talking about and how that has all of these sort of negative connotations in colonization of Africa. It's also during this time period when a lot of colonization is happening. So in the late 1800s to early 1900s, you have like the British invading Benin, which is a modern day area in Nigeria in 1897, and taking a lot of their cultural objects like Benin heads, and they're going to sort of justify the taking of those objects as well as categorizing them and cataloging them in this very negative way. So when you look at these Benin heads, which are originally used to show African kings, they would be put on the altars after that king died by the new king to represent that king, and so that they could sort of pray and show their gratitude toward that king. And they would put there would be this hole in the head where they'd put those elephant tusks. And when the British take it, they claim that these objects are showing that African people are cannibals, that they behead people, and to prove this, they put them in catalogs alongside of skulls, and they claim that objects like these, which are used for trophies, were actually sort of decapitation posts. So they do all these things to sort of prove that the Benin culture is less than the European culture so that they can continue to colonize them. So remember that this is going on very much at the same time as Expressionism and Fauvism are sort of getting their power and rolling into the 20th century. This is that exhibition that sort of talked about those heads and recontextualizing them. So here's some more images of the Benin heads, what they would have looked like on altars here as well. We also have some great advances in technology. We have the invention of cinematography by the Lumiere brothers. They're going to help produce moving pictures and films, and they're also very much well known for marketing the first commercial color photograph in 1907 through the autochrome process. Go and look at some of these photographs because they are so intensely gorgeous. The way that you think about color and how we sort of interpret color today, right? When you look at a photograph, it obviously interprets color sort of directly, but when you look at some of these older photographs, they have this sort of interesting color look that's very much sort of invented by this autochrome process. So go and take a look at them. They're really interesting. The first artistic movement we're going to look at is Fauvism, Wild Beasts of Color. So in this time period, we still have the French art community still very involved in the salon system, and artists are very dissatisfied with this system, the Autumn Salon being one of them. And the Autumn Salon had liberal juries where artists of all kinds exhibited, such as realists, impressionists, post-impressionists, symbolists, and academic artists. And they're exhibiting there at this salon system. And Louis Vasses referred to some of the young painters as fauves, meaning wild beasts. And the term captured the explosive colors and impulsive brushwork that characterized their work. He said, Donatello amongst the wild beasts. And so this group very much sort of formed around Matisse and Derain, and they became sort of the first modern movement of the 20th century, and this Fauvism term kind of stuck for them. So they reclaimed Impressionism's direct, joyous embrace of nature and combined it with Post-Impressionism's heightened color contrast and emotional expressive depth. So you'll definitely see how they're utilizing different tenets from Impressionism and Post-Impressionism to sort of combine them into Fauvism. They concentrated on color's ability to communicate directly the artist's experience of that reality by exploiting the pure chromatic intensity of paint. Each individual was focused on authenticity so that they did not create a cohesive movement. So you'll see Matisse and Derain, although they are both leaders of this group and knew each other, they're not necessarily producing artwork that looks exactly the same, which we saw in Post-Impressionism as well, so that's okay, right? And Fauvist painters practiced an art in which painting was conceived as an autonomous creating, free from certain narrative or symbolic ends. So we'll see that as we look at some of this art that sort of has some sort of strange meaning. It may be not as much meaning as we saw previously in other artistic movements. They also are going to make a particular reference to brilliant arbitrary color in sort of neo-impressionism, or what we call pointillism. So they're really interested in pointillism as invented by Seurat, and they're going to use that as well, and you'll see that in the works that we'll look at by Matisse. It really allowed for the liberation of color, in which Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Seurat were really striving for. They did not want to describe object in nature, not simply to set up retinal vibrations, not to accentuate a romantic or mystical subject, but to build new pictorial values apart from these. So they're using pure color to do this in very many ways similar to Cézanne, and you'll see the copying of Cézanne by Matisse as well. So they're very much using color theories picked from different movements before them and reinventing it into their new way. They're also, again, very much interested in African art and utilizing that as sort of a inspiration. So Matisse is the first one we're going to look at, a very important artist to Fauvism and Expressionism. This is him on the right, and here's a painting of a cat that he did, playing with some fish. The first work we're going to look at is Luxury, Calm, and Pleasure from 1904 to 1905, and this is a work very much inspired by pointillism and by Seurat. So you can see that especially with the way that he's using brushstrokes and that type of pointillism. So this is sort of a mosaic landscape. You'll also see here we have the reflection on Cézanne's work. This is some bathers as well. And this is Signac, who was also, along with Seurat, a pointillist artist. So in this painting, we have nudes on a beach. It's very sort of this interesting and fun landscape where he's using color in this very expressive mode. You have trees that are blue and the beach that is a very sort of red, vibrant color. It's not necessarily based in the reality of color, but in the feeling that the artist feels in exploring this subject matter. So he's very much thinking about this image of producing nudes on a beach as, again, inspired by Cézanne and the paintings that Cézanne would do of nudes at a beach. He also places his wife in this image as well. She's the only one that's clothed, ironically enough. And we'll see two more paintings where he paints her. She's quite a bit of his muse in a lot of his paintings. But um, Matisse encourages this idea of the heroic sort of male nude figure. So versus doing this male nude figure where they're focusing on heroic figures or athletic figures, we have the move towards producing just nude female figures. They were considered a more minor classical subject matter, and they're very much thinking about the association between women and the nude and how it compares to nature and authenticity, right? If you think of Mother Nature, she's a female. Women were more authentic, they sort of symbolize natural forms. But again, you have to also think that men are just painting nude women because there's some sort of sexual reason for doing that. So you're going to have a lot of feminists going against this idea as well and thinking like, why are all of these men painting women nude on a beach having a picnic? Like, right, that's just not realistic. So you have to think about all these sort of components to a painting like this. I think some of his most valuable works by Matisse, other than sort of his collages, which are late work, are his portraits of his wife. So this is The Woman with the Hats from 1905. It sparked controversy in this autumn salon, not because of its fairly controversial subject, but the way it was depicted. It was kind of crude and had sketchy brushwork, wild arbitrary colors that created a harsh, dissonant effect and gave it sort of this unfinished quality. So this is his wife Amelie, and she's posed for this portrait, and it depicted her in this elaborate sort of bourgeoisie outfit, but in this very kind of abstraction of what she's wearing, her hat. You don't really get a sense of what any of those objects on her body look like in any sort of specific detail. It's about color and interpreting color on her and what she looks like, right? Even her face has pieces of green and orange in her neck. And so it's about how Matisse is interpreting her in that moment, this sort of pure expressive color. And people even asked Amelie what she was wearing in this painting, and she said her dress was black, interestingly enough. So very much thinking about the way that color interprets form and how he sees her. This is another painting of her as well, portrait of Madame Matisse, The Green Line from 1905. Very much, again, another controversial piece because of this strong green line that she has across her face. So the way that people sort of saw this dominant pea green band of shadow across her face, they believed it was sort of very hideous. But in building this, the artist felt sort of free to use color independently of natural appearance, building a structure of abstract color shapes and lines, foreign to the figure, tree, or still life, that remains the basis of the structure. So it does look like Amelie, here she is in the center with Matisse, but it's about interpreting her through color, right, through expressive color, understanding and thinking about what colors you see and how you interpret them expressively and how you interpret emotions through color. So I actually find it quite interesting and quite gorgeous, but it is very much revolutionary for the time to sort of look at this and sort of be in shock at this green line on her face. Matisse also became famous for producing some of these open window pieces from 1905. It's really the first developed example of the theme for him, in that it is a small fragment of the wall or room taken up principally with large window whose casements are thrown wide to the outside world, a balcony with flower pots and vines beyond the sea, sky, and boats of the harbor at Collier. And so what he does with this, which is really interesting, painters often paint a window that looks outside. So you can sort of paint the architecture of the inside of the room as well as the nature on the outside. So this is sort of a very common subject matter for artists because you can sort of play with inside and outside interpretations. What's interesting about the way that Matisse produces this painting differently from other artists of the past is that uh, he uses these sort of very strong colors, as we've sort of talked about, with these vertical stripes of vivid green, blue, purple, and orange, with these very strong brush strokes and these stippled dots of green. The way that he's using, again, sort of pointillism, and that you can see the thick use of his brush strokes. But this is sort of most important thing about it is that when you look at this painting, rather than allowing the viewer to enter pictorial space, this tough, vibrant membrane of color and pattern draws the eye over and across, but rarely beyond the picture plane. It's almost like the scene in the window is coming towards us rather than represented realistically and sort of going away from us, right? Because we're looking at it and it's far away. It kind of looks like it approaches us. When you look at it, right, it doesn't look like it's moving far away from you. It doesn't look like these boats are on a lake or an ocean that are far away, right? It looks like it kind of comes towards you and kind of approaches you. And even like with the green leaves and the foliage, it kind of brings it to you. So it's not representing the perceptual world in any capacity. It's about this expressive color and power of color and how it can sort of bring these ideas towards you. So it's a very interesting representation of that subject matter. Another work that was in the book is The Joy of Life, 1905 to 1906, by Matisse. And here you have another work where he's blending together influences of color and sinuous undulating line, reminiscent of Art Nouveau designs. You have sort of all these figures lying around in sort of these sexual ways, right? They're all sort of doing their own thing. Very sort of sensual and expressive and sexual in some capacity. This scene here, we'll see again another one of Matisse's works. He very much reflected this work back on Bellini and Titian's The Feast of the Gods from 1514. So in looking at a very classical image, he rethinks it in Fauvism with color and expressive line. Now, again, I wanted to show this work that the book mentions because this again shows sort of the influence of quote-unquote African art. So Matisse goes to Biskra in North African desert and he paints this sort of classical Venus figure based upon African women. And so he paints this image as sort of a memory of the African country that he visited and very much paints a classical nude. And when you think about a classical nude as sort of a Venus figure, the Venus is very much a classical idea of producing a classical goddess in a new position. But what he's actually doing is painting North African women from harems, prostitutes, women who are sort of erotic, considered like sort of erotic prostitutes, and he produces an odalisque. So you have some images here. I gave you some images by Delacroix and Ang, in which they produce odalisques. And in producing sort of this erotic image of women, he moves into abstraction with it. However, he's still sort of continuing this idea of using African women, of thinking about them as objects, about sexual objects. These aren't necessarily paintings to give women power in any sort of capacity. They're very much sort of erotic portraits of nude women. And people even critiqued Matisse, saying that this one was intensely ugly and that it wasn't interesting. But he's very much sort of continuing in this vein of producing negative depictions of exotic quote-unquote women, right, that are supposed to be sort of cool and interesting, right? Oh, you want to look at this exotic and beautiful woman from another country. Sort of continuing that idea that should very much be dated at this point. Fauvism is very much ended by this time period. We're going to come back to Fauvism in just a second, but the book kind of separates Matisse's work, and I just kind of wanted to continue it through and then move on to another artist. So Fauvism ends around 1908, even though Matisse keeps producing work that's very much in the vein of Fauvism and inherent expressionism. So I wanted to give you sort of some other depictions of Matisse's work. So Harmony in Red is one of his works from 1908. This is a very large painting that was commissioned for Sergei Shukin, and it's very abstract and interesting because it focuses on the flatness of this red fabric. So Matisse is inspired by this piece of fabric that he owns, this sort of luxuriant raspberry red fabric with the energetic twists of blue pattern that seem to sink into the wall and take over the surface. And it's really interesting how he uses the wall and paints the wall this color, right? And then continues it onto the table. So you don't really get a good sense of space because you have this continued of flatness. So it kind of flattens the whole picture plane in that it looks like this goes straight into the table, right? Because here we have this female, she's sitting at a table with sort of objects, but he sort of totally flattens the space by producing this pattern continuously. So very much developing this style of flatness, similar to Van Gogh, and very much sort of in being inspired by sort of Japanese art and motifs, and he turned this motif of still lifes and a depiction of room into this very sort of impression of flatness and space with Harmony in Red. These images of dance and music are very popular pieces by Matisse. He receives a commission from a wealthy Russian industrious named Sergei Shukin again, and he produces these large canvases that are supposed to decorate his spiral staircase of his mansion in Moscow. And this is a preparatory painting that he does, and it's very sort of light, pleasure-filled. This is the image that we saw from The Joy of Life previously, of women dancing together in the nude. And the figures are very loosely drawn. There's no sort of intense definition. They're kind of like weird bag dolls. You want it to look sort of effortless and using sort of blue and green spatial ambiguity. You have sort of the green field, which seems to have some sort of weight, and the blue landscape, although this figure in the back seems to be stepping on the blue or just has their leg up. And you only have the break in space here where you think the viewer could come in and join in their sort of joyous dance. So it's very sort of it's very light, it's lightly colored, it feels very sort of light and interesting, but the final version sort of takes a different emotional character, and this kind of shows you how much color can change a work. This is the final version of that work that Matisse did, and really sort of with the change in color, right, from this lightness, it feels very light and effortless and silly, it gets very sort of dark, right, forbidding, menacing, tribal, ritualistic, demonic. You have this change that very much sort of makes you think about this sort of physical power and intensity of this. What are they doing? What could they possibly be dancing to? You still have this openness of the hand where you could join in. So it's very much sort of more foreboding than the previous interpretation. He also produces music as a secondary part of this work as well, which would have shown man's work sort of completely immersed in music and dancing. So you have this interesting movement where you think about how color can change so much of how you interpret a painting and think about it. I wish we could talk more about Matisse's collages. If you have time to go and look at them, go ahead and take a look because they're super gorgeous and interesting and very sort of interlaced with natural motifs and corals. And here you have him doing a nude woman again, but here's a collaged or paper cut version of it. So go take a look if you have the time to see how his work sort of evolved over time. Andre Derain is another really popular expressionist artist of the time as well, or Fauvist, I'm sorry. And this is his depiction of London Bridge from 1906. Again, you have an artist who's looking at older paintings. This is one by Monet from 1874, and really sort of making a brilliant Fauvist colorist version of it. So thinking about synthetic color, you have the way that the red sky sort of contrasts against the buildings that are blue and green, and you have these large color areas. So again, when you go into the space, right, you have impressionists trying to depict color and light and thinking about how that affects a landscape. And then you have people like Andre Derain who are going in and thinking about how they can use color to interpret their emotions and feelings about that work and that place. You can see that again in something like Turning Road from 1906. This is a bend in a road that is very much based on a place where Gauguin spent time and painted in this very sort of brilliant palette, the evocation of an idealized realm far from the urban bustle of London's waterways. He travels to a sort of new extreme with intensity of anti-naturalistic color. I especially like to look at the trees, right? You can look and see how they're very blue at the bottom and sort of turn into this great strong red at the top. And you can even see even all the trees along the background have that as well, which is really gorgeous and interesting, right? To think about the way that you have this sort of starts as blue and moves up into this red intensity of color. And then again, you have all these figures sort of playfully moving around the landscape. This is very much inspired by blocks of color as produced by Gauguin. Here's Vision After the Sermon that we talked about 2 weeks ago, I believe. In that using blocks of color to sort of express emotion, which Derain is going to take to another level in his works. His final work that we're going to talk about is The Dance from 1906. He very much spent a lot of time with Gauguin and went and combined ideas of Western and non-Western traditions. So he traveled sort of around different countries as well. This is The Dance from 1906, produced very much in sort of this like quote-unquote primitive or tribal looking behavior of different figures. You also have this snake which moves through the figures, which is very much representative of Adam and Eve, right? And thinking back to the devil. And you have him taking that directly from Gauguin's paintings of a snake. And he's painting this very fluent landscape of color. You have this very expressive way that this clothing is produced on this figure that's dancing, and they're moving around this landscape that's very colorful and has these big pieces of color block. Very sort of joyous and inherently primitive, right? Trying to think about these primitive aspects of the brilliant and pure color of the landscape. Very sort of spontaneous, and the outward colors are supposed to sort of the interior feeling of the characters or the artist itself. He's very much also looking back at classical sculpture, so this is something we saw in Matisse as well as Derain, in that he's painting this figure here from Delacroix's painting and reinterpreting it in this image of the dance. I wanted to mention this artist really quick. He's sort of briefly talked about in the book. He's a very sort of different Fauvist in that he was very deeply religious, Rouault, and emotional and moralistic. And so when he saw how artists were sort of portraying these different types of subject matter, like prostitutes and landscapes and primitivism, he takes these subject matter and rethinks it in his own way. And so when he produced images of prostitutes, such as this one, Filet, he was disgusted with the evils of modern society that seemed to move throughout the bourgeoisie, and he painted images of prostitutes as a symbol of this rotting society. So instead of producing prostitutes in this sort of very sexual and powerful way that Fauvist and post-impressionists have been doing up to this time. He uses it as a symbol of degenerative society and how much society has come downhill. So very different from other artists that we've seen up to this point. What I also like about Royalt, in rethinking Fauvism and the way that art is represented, is how he produces images of Christ and sort of biblical imagery. And so when you think about all these past depictions of Christ that very much represent sort of his physical pain and sort of realistic modes of interpretation in producing crucifixion scenes, he very much goes through and looks at it in a Fauvist way and thinking about color and emotion and rethinking this image. And so he produces a lot of these images of Christ and uses color in this very expressive way, and I find them very sort of interesting and powerful in their own way. Now we're leading up to Expressionism, and we have sort of some different things that are going on that are talked about at the beginning of this chapter 6, I believe, in the book. The church is sort of being replaced with secularism and the rethinking of religious morality. We have the establishment of psychology, anthropology, sociology, and art history. We have some people who feel sort of abandoned by the church and don't really know sort of where to put their allegiances. So we have some going to nationalism to focus their respect and ideas, so focusing on the values of their country or state. Some people felt very much out of place, and this also had to do with Nietzsche. For those unmoved by nationalism, unawed by religion, and uncertain of the motives of science and industry, Nietzsche's flat declaration resonated with the bleak certainty that humanity had only its own basis instincts to guide it. German Expressionism is the visual corollary to Nietzsche's statement, God is dead. So what we have happening is that Expressionists very much sort of feel this weird sort of turn of the century point in which they feel sort of displaced, and they reproduce that in their art. We will see that for most artists, but it's not true obviously for all artists, especially Kandinsky, who's very much sort of invested in art and spirituality. So this period is very much considered to be called German Expressionism. Sometimes they'll call it just Expressionism as well. It developed before World War I, so we really haven't made it to World War I yet. It's first in a writing and poetry and literature, and then moves to artistic fields. There are different ways that the word Expressionism has said to be formed. One of them has to do with an exhibition called Expressionismes in 1901. The other is by a Czech art historian, Matjšek, in 1910. An expressionist wishes above all to express himself, an expressionist rejects immediately perception and builds on more complex psychic structures, impressions, and mental images that pass through people's soul as through a filter which rids them of substantial accretions to produce their clear essence, and are assimilated and condensed into more general forms, into types which he transcribes through simple shorthanded formulae and symbols. That's quite a mouthful. But very much sort of thinking about how we move from Fauvism into Expressionism and the Expressionism of color. So very much of the emphasis on intensely personal aesthetic explorations, like in Romanticism. It often was a reference to a work of art that had an emphasis on emotional content, again continuing to use a vibrant palette that strayed from natural observation. Other points of similarity included the distortion of flattening of perspective space, the energetic handling of media, and interest in art historical tradition. These artists were not trained artistically like Derain and Matisse. They were very much, some of them are architects, and some of them just decide to join the artistic world based upon their inspiration and the feeling that they have with connection with that work. And they very much sort of engaged with the ideas of God is dead by engaging with contemporary social issues. The first artist that we're going to look at actually is Paula Modersohn-Becker, and the reason I want to talk about her and that she's mentioned in the book is that she's a very important female German Expressionists. So she worked with Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cézanne, and she was very much inspired by their work and distilling and simplifying forms in color. But she's the first artist to produce she is the first female to produce a self-portrait of herself in the nude. So this simplified shapes and crude outline, very much again in the primitive style, but showing this very sort of sexual, natural image of herself. You have flowering plants, tenderly holding a flower, echoes the shapes of her breasts, appearing to be a natural being in tune with her surroundings. So very much giving sort of intellectual agency and power to the female figure in this painting, and being sort of the first one to pursue this artistic avenue of a self-portrait of herself in the Expressionist period. She also painted this image, self-portrait of her 6th wedding anniversary, where she represents herself frankly in full bloom of pregnancy. So again, reclaiming part of the nude as a fully human subject and not just a motif, and rethinking the power of the female figure and identity in producing these sort of images of herself. Unfortunately, she died soon after giving birth to her first child, so we didn't get to see a lot of her work, but it's very interesting the way that she's changing and rethinking the idea of the female nude in her work. There are 2 separate versions of Expressionism that we're going to talk about that sort of separate themselves by geography as well as a subject matter that they're focusing on. The first is Die Brücke, which is the bridge. They link all revolutionary and fermenting elements. They were very much architects drawn together who wanted to be painters and change the way paintings were being created. They are inspired by Munch and Van Gogh, as well as Gothic angularity, and their subjects focus on stark portraits of prostitutes and dancers, frankly eroticized depictions of child models, and unsettling scenes of urban leisure and decadence. So they're different from the next section we're going to look at, the Blue Reiter, in also how they depict figures and how they talk about society in general. So we'll see that in looking at Kirchner's work. So this is an important Expressionist painting by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And you can see very much how he's continuing to use color in very much sort of the Fauvism vein, but instead thinking about sort of societal alienation. So this work and the work we're going to look at next, which I find more powerful, they're very much talking about bohemian life and figures in the street, and thinking about sort of the individual value of figures in this space. And this is very sort of a dream state, and Kirchner is very much thinking about alienation. And when you go into the city, you feel alienated because there are all these people around you, but you don't know any of them, you don't talk to them, and so you sort of feel overwhelmed by your loneliness. This is another image by Kirchner that I find to really express this more than Street Dresden, where he looks at urban life and street scenes. You have on the left 2 prostitutes, their profession sort of advertised by their large feathery hats and fur-trimmed coats, and they strut past these well-dressed bourgeoisie men, their potential clients. You can see them on the right, sort of moving potentially into a car or a mode of transportation. And he uses this intense angularity and use of color to really express this moment. And you have these bodies crowded together. You have this idea of victims of modern urban alienation in these harsh colors, tilted perspective, angular lines, in that he's thinking about these people in the city. These women are trying to get the attention of the men, but there's still sort of this stark line drawn between them. And although it sort of looks happy with these sort of pinks and purples, you get very sort of this darkness and creepiness to it with the way that these men are depicted, right? Like even in the far back, these silhouettes that are almost like ghost-like figures, right? These sort of slender, weird creatures. And so although at first you get this feeling that it could be a positive seen by the pinks and the purples, it very much becomes this sort of artificial, dehumanized world of faces and stiff gestures, right? So Kirchner very much saw the prostitute as a symbol of the modern city, where glamour and danger and intimacy and alienation necessarily coexisted, and everything else was for sale. So very much think about this work as this moment of alienation, of destabilization, this feeling of people in cities that don't feel connected to one another, and how prostitution can be sort of a symbol for that historically. Kirchner and the Bridge Group are also going to paint this female figure a lot. Her and her siblings were favorite model of the Bridge Group, and they were children of a deceased circus performer and helped pay for their life with modeling. She is a young girl and posed in this very sort of sexual way, and she stares at you in this very sort of affronting and assertive way. And although we get the perception that her clothing is childlike, and you have this figure that's represented an African piece of art in the background, very much connecting with authenticity, you really start to question why Kirchner is painting her this way. Why is there this use of color on her face that's very acidic green, right? Again, juxtaposing this very acidic green against the red and blue of her lips and her cheekbones and her dress. And so these color choices give you a weird sense of uncertainty or danger. Why is her face this color and her arms are a completely different color? Is it a mask that she's trying to wear? Do you have to rethink the way that you interpret this young girl and what she's trying to portray? Is Kirchner producing a sexual portrait of this girl, or is it something completely different? So you have to really think about why this group would be so interested in painting children and how that could be sort of seen as nefarious. I wanted to mention that there is a revival of printmaking at this time, and we're going to see that with Aaron Heckel. This is another image of Franzi as well, this 12-year-old girl. And again, this also is sort of running in this sort of nefarious vein in that here we have a nude image of a 12-year-old girl, right? Even though he's producing this very interesting woodblock print, which is quite gorgeous in that it uses this separation of block color in black, green, and red, very much in the style of Munch and sort of brilliant abstraction, you still are very much involved in kind of the sexuality of the sitter, of looking at this girl sexually, and she's only 12, right? So you have to think about why these artists are producing these very sexual images of these children. The bridge very much dissolves in 1913 because of protests that Kirchner was saying he was the leader of the group, and so they very much dissolve very shortly after this time period. The other group of Expressionism is called the Blue Reiter, and it's very much germinating in Munich around the figure of Vasily Kandinsky. You have no single style again, but group using form and color and space, along with expressions of moods and emotions. And they viewed contemporary industrial society with skepticism. So instead of focusing on the city, like Kirchner, they retreat to rendering nature and folk culture. Very much so, this movement is focused around the work of Vasily Kandinsky. You'll see his name either way, depending on how you research him, Vasily or Vasily. So that's just usually preference, but he very much pursues art and Art Nouveau style, and he becomes really the pioneer of abstract art. He's really sort of the precursor to abstraction in using non-objective images and looking at works of art. There's a story about how he walked into his studio and one of his paintings was on its side, and when he couldn't recognize the image because it was on its side, he very much only saw the lines and the shapes and was inspired by that. Kandinsky is also going to write a book called Concerning the Spiritual and Art. He very much talks about spiritual and biblical ideas in his work. He wanted to understand that relationship, and he also very much thinks about the relationship of art and music, and thinking about expressing spiritualism and ideas through music, through art, and thinking about this sort of inner creative force. He wrote, "The harmony of color and form must be based solely upon the principle of proper contact with the human soul." So as the artist who's sort of the first one to kind of really think in full abstraction, he thinks about music, and his works are called compositions, improvisations, and thinks about how music and art and spirituality all connect to one another. So in work like something like Composition 7, he's very much thinking about abstraction. He's looking at cosmic conflict in works like biblical ideas from Genesis, as well as the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. He's thinking about cataclysm, of rebirth, and uses all of these colors and shapes and lines to collide in this space in sort of this furious explosion of feeling and spontaneity. And so he produces this painting, which is really the first in abstraction that we see, that expresses these emotions of music and art and biblical feelings. So really, you have to think about his paintings as an explosion of emotion and line, and how he's sort of inserting his feelings and ideas into a painting. Now, this is not just something like Pollock's splatter paintings. He spends time really thinking about these works, studying them, trying to think them through in sort of abstract form. So this is a study for that composition on the top left here. And even though it's very much an abstraction, you still see little images sort of come through that kind of look like they could be symbolic of something. So like a boat with 3 oars here at the bottom, maybe a sign of biblical floods. So he uses this very furiously explosive assembly of color and line work in a sort of expressing his emotions. Improvisation 28 is also another popular work by him that very much has sort of an image of a horse and a rider. So you can kind of see the horse here, as well as the rider that's in the center, and like a little house in the background. So you can sort of pick out these elements, maybe even a mountain, right? Here's the horse's face, very much sort of symbolizing spirituality in a crusade and movement and color, and you sort of catch these moments of, oh, is that a horse, or is it not a horse? Is he trying to portray a horse? So very interesting use of abstraction, and he's really sort of the beginning of that work. The book mentions Gabriele Munter very briefly. In her production of lino cuts, she produces images of family and friends through this sort of black outline printmaking, very much using sort of expressionist and Fauvist color to emulate individual figures. So I threw that in here from the book. Here's Arlie and Kandinsky as well in prints. Franz Marc is also a very popular and important Blue Reiter expressionist. Ironically enough, as part of the Blue Reiter, he produced blue horses. So he produced a lot of images of horses. He very much thinks about creating animals as a part of spiritual harmony and purity in nature and richness in color. He uses these 3 sort of large, brilliant horses to think about their power and their expressive nature. And you have the close-up view of the horses really filling most of the canvas, and the blueness and their bodies very much mimic the rolling hills in the background. You don't get very much a separation of space necessarily in the separation between the landscape and the figures themselves. And you get a sense of it a little bit because he puts these kind of two tree trunks to separate you, right? So here's the back, here's the front. But he's producing these sort of undulating lines of horses and color to think about spiritual harmony and purity. He also very much thought about color in very sort of symbolic forms. So blue being a masculine principle, robust and spiritual, yellow, feminine principle, gentle, serene, and sensual, and red as brutal and heavy. This is another work that's very popular by him, The Tower of Blue Horses. This work was unfortunately lost during World War II. The Nazis took it and it was never found again. But again, starting to look more into aspects of cubism and abstraction and using shape to produce images, as well as color and focusing on spirituality in animals. I really like this work, especially The Fate of the Animals. Seems very sort of poignant as what's sort of happened recently in Australia. You have The Fate of Animals, which is sort of very, very different from his other works that we've seen in depicting animals in sort of this peaceful manner. Here you have this sort of brutal image of the burning down of a forest, and the sort of distress of the animals. So you'll see like a deer, some boar, another sort of horses potentially up here, a wolf. Now, you have this sort of strong way in which he's using line and shape and color to really show the intensity of this work. Unfortunately, the painting was damaged right here on the right. And his close friend Paul Klee restored the work and added color and this brown color. So originally it was not this brown color, but he sort of restored it to this capacity, his friend, Mark's friend. But I kind of find it interesting because here you have kind of the destruction of color as sort of this fire and chaos takes over the painting. So you have this sort of intensity that's continued throughout the painting and maybe sort of this encroaching horror from the right. Kathy Kollwitz was another famous expressionist. She's not talked about in the book at all, I don't believe. But she's a very famous German artist, and she actually is very different from other expressionists in that she's using line and not color necessarily. So her work, a lot of it is thought about in sort of revolution and rebellion. The work I'm going to show you here is from her Peasants' War series, and she's reflecting on this event where there was sort of the brutal treatment of peasants in the 16th century by Germany. The peasants revolted, and the Germans sort of took them over and murdered them very sort of, what is the word that I want? Dramatically. And tragically. And so she is very much promoting the working class and the pursuit of social change through printmaking, really invested in people who are oppressed and disempowered. And so she depicts these sort of images from the Peasants' War to represent that. We have the oncoming of World War I, and so you definitely have people feeling sort of displaced and feeling disempowered. So the Outbreak from the Peasants' War series is one of those work. You show the peasants built up in the fury on the right, and you have this figure in sort of the off-center who's Black Anna. She was a female figure during revolutionary times, and she has her back to the viewer, and you don't focus on her face and her head, but instead on the motion and the silhouette against the sky in which she invigorates and moves the troop forward of frenetic, poor individuals. And so you have this really intense movement left of all of these figures plunging into battle at her will. And so it's very creepy, sort of very dark, and but also empowering in that she's giving empowerment to these people. The energy and the strength of these people, the desire for their oppression to be over, is represented in this work. She also very much is invested in producing images of women and their dead child, very much sort of in the Pietà range of the Virgin Mary holding Christ after he's been crucified. Here you have a woman grieving over her own dead child. Kolowitz is going to suffer the death of her own son in World War I. And you have this very raw animalistic anguish on a mother's face and the abject posture of her naked body as she holds the death of her child. So very much exploring emotion and line in a very different way than we've seen previously because of the medium that she's using, which is print work and etching. This last sort of part of the movement that the book talks about is Expressionism in Austria. And we see two different artists in Austria producing Expressionist work, although they are very much not connected to one another. So Egon Schiele is the first artist that the book talks about, and he's a very powerful artist in the way that he looks at the body and the figure. So he was a very sort of tragic figure. He was inspired by Gustav Klimt, whose work is very sort of powerful and beautiful in many ways. Egon Schiele actually works in sort of intense and raw sexuality. So he actually experienced a lot of physical and psychological trauma. His father had suffered from untreated syphilis and died insane when he was 14 years old. So syphilis can get in your brain if it's untreated and slowly make you sort of insane. And so his son was left with this link between sex and suffering, and he actually dies at 28 at the from influenza. And so he very much has a lot of psychological and physical suffering that he endures, and he very much puts that into his work. This is the first work that the book talks about, and I think it's really interesting in that it's showing a very different image of an artist painting a nude figure. So here he is drawing this prostitute that he has in his studio, and it's sort of this self-revelatory document of personal anguish, this intense portrayal of the artist in the background with his narrow gaze, looking at this model, and you can tell that she's looking in a mirror, right? And this reflection, this very sort of psychological tension and explicit sexuality that is portrayed in this image is very, very powerful. A lot of his self-portraits, you can really see this very tormented view of himself that he had. So in this work, you have the artist staring at the viewer with anguish expression, emaciated body, stretched into an uncomfortable position. He's bony and angular, bristles with inner tension made visible by the agitated pencil line. I mean, even the lines of his medium feel agitated, feel psychologically painful, right, in the way that he uses pencil marks. He stares wildly, his large dark eyes glaring menacingly, his mouth open, his shock of hair standing at an end. He even has sort of missing body parts in that his hand is missing on the right. You have his genitals not being visible, having to do something with castration, maybe for his belief that he indulged too much in masturbation, which people at the time believed would lead to insanity. And so Egon Schiele is very much producing this portrait in a reflection of his own imperfections and believing that he's sort of psychologically inferior. You can also see this in his portrait of Paris on Gütersloh from 1918, in which he produces an image of his friend. And even in a work like this, where you have a figure totally clothed, you can see the focus on the figure's hands, on the body that seems animated in nervous energy, the paint build up in jagged brushstrokes of harsh and dissonant tones of ochre, red, and cobalt, and very much using this technique to reveal psychology. Oskar Kokoschka is the last artist we're going to look at in Austria Expressionism that the book mentioned here, and this is his portrait of Adolf Loos from 1909. So Oskar Kokoschka very much produces portraits as well, similarly to Egon Schiele, in sort of this expressionist mode. So these are black portraits. He sort of searched passionately to expose inner sensibility, which may have belonged more to himself than his sitters. This is his friend, Adolf Loos, who supported him. And you have this sort of very contemplative, dark, moment of tension, very much sort of echoed in Lou's nervously clasped hands, that may have represented more the inner psychology of Kokoschka himself versus his actual sitter. He also painted this image, this romantic image of him and his lover, Alma Mahler, in this image of sort of flickering light-saturated brushstrokes that are swept through a dream landscape of cold blue mountains and valleys lit in the gleam of the shadow moon. You have this very expressive and interesting image of him and her sleeping together, and the tempest, right, which is a storm, and how it connects the two figures together in this sort of languid movement of the brushstrokes. Now, the book really sort of drops a bomb on you, which is that Kokoschka and his relationship with Mahler, who he produced in this previous painting, ends, which shatters Kokoschka. He's completely heartbroken. And so he convinces a Munich mannequin and doll maker to make him a doll of Mahler, his lover. And the book just shows you this painting and says, oh, well, he used this doll as a prop for several paintings, like this woman in blue, which is really weird. And that's all they say. And if you look it up, weirdly enough, this is what that doll looked like. That was supposed to look like Alma Mahler. And this doll maker produced this nude figure for him, applied downy feathers to the doll's exterior to make it feel like skin, which is super weird. Here is her producing the doll. And so Kokoschka has this really weird sort of backstory, right? He says, I would die of jealousy if some man were allowed to touch the artificial woman in her nakedness with his hands, or glimpse her with his eyes. When shall I be able to hold this in all my hands? Hold all this in my hands. And so he finally gets this doll after communication with this mannequin doll maker, and really trying to get at the core of what he wants in this doll, and this is his response to receiving it. I was honestly shocked by your doll, which, although I was long prepared for a certain distance from reality, contradicts what I demanded of it and hoped to in too many ways. The outer shell is a polar bear pelt, suitable for a shaggy imitation bedside rug, rather than the soft and pliable skin of a woman. The result is that I cannot even dress the doll, which you knew was my intention, let alone array her in delicate and precious robes. Even attempting to pull on one stocking would be asking a French dancing master to waltz with a polar bear. So he has this doll, he poses her for paintings, and this is sort of his pain expressed in losing his love in sort of this sort of really dark and cryptic way. Yeah, I know you all wanted to know that. This last artist that the book talks about is Konstantin Brancusi, who sort of doesn't fit into any of the artistic movements at this time, because he's very much sort of looking at abstraction and the abstraction of form. Sometimes I put him in futurism, but we're just going to throw him here at the end. So this is him, the production of a torso of a young man, in that you can see sort of the legs and the torso of a figure, but he's very much sort of abstracted it. Excuse me. Some of his main subject matter that he focused on that I think are the most powerful are A Bird in Flight. He very much wanted to render the essence of a bird taking off in flight and thinking about the streamlined silhouette of the bird as they sort of moved into flight itself. And so as you sort of see him think about this work, it sort of progresses and progresses. And eventually he comes to his final image of what he thinks it should look like, which is Bird in Space. And he really thinks about how the motion of a bird looks, right? When you see a bird and the bird moves so quickly in space and in motion that you can't even see the physical details of the body. He tries to represent that in a piece of sculpture. He also very much is interested in abstraction of images, in that he has this production of an image of an egg, but that's also not only supposed to symbolize birth and rebirth, but is in the image of a newborn child. So if you can see it, here are the eyes, and then the mouth of the child as they cry, right, and the little sort of bottom of the lip. So thinking about sort of a shrieking of an infant's head combined with an egg, and this sort of primal shout of the baby as it leaves the womb and enters a new, more problematic level of existence. The book also mentions this work, Endless Column, from the 1930s. In Romania, he's commissioned to do this after World War I, so this is a memorial to soldiers after World War I. And he sought this sort of elicit universal transcendent experience through sculpture that speaks to the optimism of humanity's essential nature and pure joy in sort of this endless column that moves upward. And really what this work sort of symbolizes in thinking about what's to come in the 1910s, right? In 1914, World War I is going to happen, and the Great Depression, right? This work is after very much that time period. And so this work kind of sets us up to start thinking about Cubism and what we're going to see next week in the beginning of World War I and how artists sort of react to that. So we will talk about that next week.